The previous generation Honda Civic Type R was a pretty universally loved car. In fact, it was so good that about the only complaint you could lob at it was how ridiculous it looked.
But at least when you're driving it, you can't see the outside.
So when Honda set out to make the latest generation Honda Civic Type R, if you ask me and many other people, all they really had to do was make it not look like a Transformer. And they did that. But they also made a bunch of other changes. So today we're going to find out whether or not this is still the enthusiast car of choice in this segment. And we're going to achieve that by taking a look outside, inside. I'm going to show you some of the features and technology they pack into this car. We're going to try and throw a bike in the back to see if it's still as usable as ever. And then most importantly, we're going to take it out on the road to see what it's like to drive. We've already touched on the styling, but what do you think? Leave a comment below as to whether or not you like the previous generation styling more or this brand new one. If you ask me, to my eyes, this is a much better looking car. Much more mature, of course, than the previous generation, but it still has an aggression to it. If you look at it from the front end and you see how wide this front track is, you know it means business. It has wider fenders and, of course, wider wheels and tires, and still has enough flair to it to differentiate it and make it look fun and interesting without looking too boring. And this is a bit anecdotal, but I've driven a lot of cars recently and no car has gotten more attention than this one. People that aren't even car enthusiasts seem to really like the way it looks and want to know more about it. Like I said, a bit anecdotal, but still kind of cool. Wheels and tires are actually a pretty big change on this car compared to the previous generation. You now get 265 30 19-inch tires, and that's a pretty big difference in both dimensions. The last car had a 20-inch diameter wheel, so we've gone down in diameter, but we have increased in width quite substantially, 20 millimeters actually to be exact. The previous car had 245 width tires. So of course, with a wider track, you're gonna get more grip. And then of course, they're taking it quite seriously here with this Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tire, which is a quite sticky tire. One of the many highlights of the previous generation Civic Type R was in fact the 2-liter turbocharged engine. And good news, this is more or less a carryover of that engine, albeit it has been slightly tweaked. Most notably, the turbocharger has been changed a bit and it now makes 315 horsepower. That's about 9 more horsepower than the previous generation, and it also makes 15 pound-feet of torque more than the previous gen as well. So a nominal increase in power, but what's nice is that this car still gets pretty good fuel economy for a performance car, 22 city, 28 highway. Now, of course, this car is only offered in one transmission, and that's a 6-speed manual, and that is, of course, how God intended. Hopping inside the Civic Type R is really where we see the benefit of this car being based on the Civic. If you look back at my previous videos where I covered the base Civic, I really spoke highly of that interior, and that's because realistically, it's some of the best in this segment. It's just very well built for the price point, albeit this is now a $45,000 car, so we might be pushing that a little bit, but still extremely functional and extremely solid. So the things that are important, of course, in a car like this, the experience on the interior doesn't distract from the driving itself, because first and foremost, that's what this car is all about, having a fun driving experience. So none of this other stuff really takes away from that. It all kind of blends into the background in a good way. So of course, with this screen here, decent size, of course you have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. So that's really all you need to know anymore. That's what everyone uses, right? But you still get things like a physical volume knob, physical HVAC controls, something I drone on and on about, but quite important in a car like this. And then, of course, another nice touch in here is this textured plastic that they put on the center console, as opposed to piano gloss black plastic that was in the Honda Accord that I just drove. So kind of nice that they're still doing that. Of course, the big differences here compared to the regular car are this shift knob and shifter, which we'll talk a little bit more about on the drive, how that feels, but the shift knob specifically is an aluminum shifter, and it is quite cold here in Colorado. Every time I get in this car, this thing is freezing. So that's not super cool, but easily changeable. Something worth mentioning. The big changes in here versus the regular car, of course, you still have a all digital display, which the higher trim base Civics get. This one has a little more flair with the Civic Type R mode, but the seats and carpet are, of course, the big changes here. The seats are fantastic. I mean, you don't even have to caveat and say, for the price point, they're some of the best. They're just like some of the best seats that you can get in a reasonably priced, under $100,000 car. Insanely supportive, and they look really, really cool, of course, in red as well. Only caveat I'll say is there's no adjustable lumbar. However, they are supportive in a way that the lumbar feels pretty reasonable, and I feel like you could put miles on these and not be too tired. Now, I'll say as well, the back seats are still quite usable as well. I can sit behind myself, I have leg room, and I have just enough headroom. Maybe my hair is grazing the ceiling, but even that, once again, is actually better than the Accord that we got out of, which is kind of mind-boggling. So overall, hugely successful interior. And I think the big takeaway here is that when you compare this to the GR Corolla, which I think is a natural competitor, if you're comparing them side by side, the interior is a huge step up compared to that car. It's just better built, it's slightly more functional, and I think that goes a long way, especially if you're considering daily driving either one of these cars. But I think that's plenty about the interior. Let's try and grab a bike in the back to see if this car is that daily driver usable or not.
One of the big advantages of a hot hatch, specifically the new Civic, is just how much usable space it now has. It truly rivals some CUVs in terms of usefulness and, crucially, has a very wide hatch opening. That last part is usually the deciding factor when it comes to the bike test, as most vehicles are usually long enough to fit a bike lengthwise, but without a wide opening, the front wheel typically has to come off. Not so in the Civic. Throw your bike in either way and it fits without the front wheel removed. This may be a huge benefit to someone cross-shopping this with a GR Corolla, which can't even come close to this practical space. As always, if you enjoyed the bike test, make sure you're hitting the subscribe button so you don't miss future content.
My favorite thing, bar none, of the previous generation Civic Type R was its dual personality. Because it could be an incredibly fun and engaging car and quick, but also it was super practical and it was super comfortable. And it's pretty apparent that with this new car, they've slid the scale and it's a little more one-dimensional. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm saying that this is now even more a track-focused weapon. But unfortunately, where it sacrifices is that dual sport personality. So that comes with pros and cons. Let's start first with the pros. I already talked about the precision of this car is insane. I mean, of course, in the front-wheel drive category, you can't find anything better, but even just in this sort of segment, comparing it to the GR Corolla, Elantra N, it's so good. The steering, while it doesn't have a ton of feel, and maybe it does have slightly less than the last generation car, I don't know, I'd have to drive them back to back, it's close, but I feel like the last generation car had a little more feel than this, but the precision and the front end. A good front end is really the basis to any good sports car. When it obeys what you want to do, offers grip. Oh, it's beautiful. This engine is fast. And then the brakes. Ooh, I love these brakes. Super firm pedal. Great feedback from the brakes. They do not fade. At least they haven't on this mountain road. And then the suspension and body and rigidity and handling. It's so flat. Cyclist, give him a wide berth. It is so flat handling. Just keeps letting you turn in. Mwah. Like, so good, just like the last car. But the downside to that is, of course, we are on a very smooth road right now. But what happens when you get on broken pavement? What happens when you get on regular streets? What happens when you're kind of going in and out of parking lots with embankments and ramps and stuff like that? This is an extremely stiff car. And while the last car was really compliant and somehow surprisingly so, given the fact that it was on 20-inch wheels, this car on 19-inch wheels is firmer. So clearly they have dialed up the suspension quite a bit. And to me, it's too far. It's too firm. This is supposed to be an all-around fun, daily driver, practical, comfortable. But they're going too far, at least in my opinion, in this like pursuit of track times and track focusedness with the suspension. Because when you get this on a bumpy road, it is jarring. It is seriously jarring. So I think that's one of my biggest complaints about it, is that they're taking away the fact that this is intended to be your one car. You can have fun in it, and you can do all your daily errands and put kids in the back, put stuff in the back, and have it be comfortable. Now, I guess you can still put people in the back and things in the hatch. It's still usable, but it's just too firm. The other thing with these wider tires is, of course, you get more grip, which is great. But they do tramline, certainly more than the last car. Tramline meaning that if there's unevenness in the pavement, it will kind of follow that unevenness in the pavement. That's just a thing with wider front tires in cars. That just happens. And then the other thing is these tires, they only work when it's warm outside. Like, only. We are above 50 degrees here, and I've already done a couple laps on this mountain to get these things fired up. This steering wheel will try and rip out of your hands if you are going like balls to the wall and the tires are not warmed up. The torque steer has not been completely dialed out. It's been partially mitigated, and when the tires are warm, you somehow feel it less, which is kind of weird. But when these tires are not warm, I mean, you're kind of in for a ride, which in some cases is fun, right? Like it adds to the excitement when you're like holding on for dear life. When you give it full power, you get full torque, and it's like, see right there, it's pulling me. But not too bad because the tires are warm. But when they're cold, which is, often until you get them warmed up, it's really always scrabbling for grip. And some people like that in a front wheel drive car, or I should say, some people like front wheel drive cars and the sensation that gives. I'm not sure I'm one of them. Like I said, it does add to the excitement a little bit, but I don't know. It's so hard for me with this car because it's so good, it's so razor sharp, but I just go back and forth on, is it the fact that it's less usable kind of really brings it down a peg for me. And that's when it kind of makes sense to kind of bring in the GR Corolla into the conversation, because with that car, there's pluses and minuses too. But from a all-around one car to do it all standpoint, it's hard to think about that being worse, because the suspension is softer, so it's more compliant. It's better from your day-to-day setting on broken roads. It's nowhere near as sharp as this. Of course, like this is way better around a racetrack. It's more fun slightly on a canyon road, but you just kind of like lose that all-weatherness that you get with the GR Corolla. You know, not only just the tires, but of course all-wheel drive, this car being front-wheel drive. But to get a front-wheel drive car super hooked up, you have to put super sticky tires on it, which means they don't work when it's cold. And then there's this whole other aspect of, well, the interior of this car is nicer than the GR Corolla. So in that sense, it's a nicer place to live on a daily basis. So I'm incredibly torn on this car. It is, after all, the best front-wheel drive car. It is an absolute blast. But at $45,000, when you start to think about it as a $45,000 primarily track toy, primarily maybe nice weather car, I don't know, is a hatchback front-wheel drive car really the best use for that? Like, if you're gonna have one car, sure, get a hatchback, that makes sense. But if you're gonna have multiple cars, maybe get something a little more focused, something that was from the ground up meant to be a sports car. I don't know, those are kind of my thoughts, and that's why I really go back and forth on this. I absolutely adored that last generation car, and this one is still very good. I just wish they made it a little more compliant like the last car. It's probably my biggest complaint with it. But otherwise, if you can get your hands on one, it's probably gonna hold its value, and people seem to love it. I drive this thing around, and non-car people seem to somehow be drawn to it. I don't really, frankly, understand how that works, but it is a pretty cool looking car. So outside of all the performance stuff, from a usability standpoint, there is a bit of road noise in here, probably to do with these sticky tires and the wider tires. It's not as quiet as your standard Civic. There's not really any wind noise, but the road noise is fairly high. I'm so torn. I'm so torn on this car. It's still super fun. The shifter is amazing, and I can't think of a car of any price that really rivals this, other than maybe a Porsche GT car from a shifter point of view. I mean, these shifters in these Hondas are so good. Short throw, great linkage, outside of the fact that it's freezing cold when you start the day because it's a metal shift knob. I don't know. It is a great package, and it is also a little bigger than the GR Corolla, so it kind of does give you more space. You can see that I'm really talking myself through this as we go through this review. I've just been so back and forth during the entire week that I've had this car, but overall, you know, it's a Civic Type R. It's everything that everyone really wanted these to be. It's razor focused. I would love to drive it on a track. I think that's really where this thing shines. But overall, it's a slightly less usable car than the last one. Take of that what you will. Let me know what you think in the comments below of the Civic Type R, and if you made it this far in the video, thank you very much. I appreciate it. We'll see you in the next one. Consider hitting the subscribe button too if you made it this far. See you guys.